Okay, Ms. Shapiro's back, my little animalcules, and we're talking a little bit about fertility rates, and we're going to go through what we call the demographic transition model. Okay, so we talked about how populations ultimately seek to get what we call the zero population growth. That means they're not changing, they're not increasing, they're not decreasing. My arm's moving all over the place. We're not increasing, we're not decreasing, we're just kind of staying kind of steady. Okay, we haven't talked about what number we want to stay steady at, but let's just say we want to stop increasing. There's too many people, we don't have enough resources, we just want to go steady. So that's what we're talking about, okay? So how do you get that fertility rate to decline? So fertility rates have declined everywhere except for Africa. The greatest fertility reduction has been in Southeast Asia. We're talking about India. And then China's one-child policy has decreased the fertility rate from 6 in 1990 to 1.6 in 2009. Remember that they were limited to just one child, although some families could apply for an exception and have two. And that was actually removed, I think, maybe 2016, 2017. And so what we saw was, though, during that time from 1990 to when it was removed, is we saw lots of abortion and forced sterilization. We saw infanticide. That means that we're killing babies, particularly those of girls. Boys are preferred over females because they don't cost their family any money. A lot of those families still have what we call a dowry, meaning that the wife's family pays the husband's family to get married. And so it costs money to have a daughter, and also because typically daughters take care of their families, but males bring in the money. Okay, this is going to cause social problems. It's also going to cause a gender imbalance. And so right now we see that there's tons and tons of males that don't have any wives, and so they're unable to have their families of their own because there's just not enough girls. So children have always been part of the labor force. And so my mom is from a big old Italian family, farming family, used to say, well, I didn't have you because I wanted you. I had you to do stuff for me. So, and that's not really, but kind of. And so what we see is that families always have to have had children because they provided a source of income. If you were a family and you were working on a farm, that is free labor for you. And we see that this fertility is starting to decline because that's no longer the case. Okay. Children are no longer allowed to work. Like you can work at like a family business maybe, or like on a family farm, but you are not allowed to be employed at an outside location until you're like, what, 14 to work at the grocery store, and then 16 to work other places. And so it's not exactly the same now that we're not an agrarian or an agriculture-based society anymore. It's expensive to raise children. I think something said bare minimum, it costs families $100,000 to raise a child. And now we have a pension system. So you're getting money from the government in the form of Social Security. And so you don't need children in order to have somebody to take care of them when they're old. The government, via Medicare and Social Security, will help take care of old people. Some of it is urbanization. As we move into the cities, we see that children aren't, they're more expensive and they're not as needed because we're not on those farms. Educational and employment opportunities for women, that's the big thing, okay? And so what we see is that women are entering into the workforce, and they're entering into all types of jobs. They're doctors, and they're engineers, and they're businesswomen, and they're lawyers, and they're running hunting companies, and they're running any kind of company that we see, they're doing that, okay? We've also seen that the average age of women the first time they get married has begun to increase. So I just got married this past year. I'm 34, kind of old. But what we see is typically that women that wait until 25 or older to marry and have children have fewer children on average than those who have their first child at a younger age, okay? We see that we now have reliable birth control, and that means access to birth control. And we also see that some of these religious beliefs and cultural norms of having really large families, when I say, like, oh, my mom was on a really big Italian farming family, that meant something, right? So our family was Catholic, and so that was the norm to have lots and lots of children. And now we see that Catholicism is changing. They're not exactly allowing for birth control, but they're changing those norms to where you don't need to have 10, 11, 12 kids, or like the Duggars, well, that family's got like, what, 20 some odd kids? That's weird. And so we're seeing some of these norms that say, hey, you don't need to have that many kids, okay? It's not beneficial. Religious beliefs allow for the use of family planning. That's going to decrease the number of children, and just overall traditions. We just don't have as many big families. Not to say that we don't have any, some people do, and that's great. It's just not the norm anymore. Okay, and so if we look at this again, we see time on our x-axis. That would make sense because we have a line graph. And now we see children born per woman. So this is developed countries. It began to decline. And then here we are, we're projected. So clearly this is a little bit old because we're all the way over here. We need this to start to kind of, we don't want it to increase a little bit, but it has kind of gone up. We've seen that Asia has declined dramatically. Africa has beginning to decline. We need it to decline even more. We want to reach this 2.1 that I talked about in the population vocab video. We want to reach this 2.1 because that's the point at which our population isn't growing. And that's our ultimate goal, that zero population growth. Okay. And so what we want to talk about is we want to talk a little bit about this movement. So as this country moves from being all the way up here to being down here, that's called the demographic transition model. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. Okay. And overall, what we see is that a stable pre-industrial state has high birth rates and high death rates. And we're ultimately going to change to a post-industrial state of low birth rates and low death rates. And so as mortality decreases, there's less need for large families, parents invest more time, death rates fall due to before the birth rates, and so this population is going to begin to grow. And so you typically see it on a graph, and it looks like this, okay? So here's our pre-industrial stage, here's our post-industrial stage. Some of them, if you took human geo, some of them will even have another one here where this birth rate, this population level is declining. So the birth rate is way under, this green line is way under the red line, and that's bad. We don't like that. Countries like Japan are facing that, and it's causing a lot of problems in their economy. So here we say that the birth rate and the death rate are both high, okay? So lots of babies are born, lots of them die, lots of children are dying. And so ultimately we have this, this is pretty even here. As countries move from a pre-industrial stage to a transitional stage, the first thing that starts to happen is we have more food and we have access to healthcare. And so that causes the death rate to fall. The norms of having big families, if you have 6 or 7 kids, but you expect 3 of them to die because we're here and my death rate is very high, you're really only left with 3 kids. Well, if you need to have 7 kids, that means that you might need to birth 10 children so that 7 survive, or you need to birth 11 children so that 7 need to survive. But as we have access to vaccines and healthcare and clean water, more and more of them are surviving. So that death rate falls, but we still haven't gotten that through our heads yet. It takes a long time to change cultural perceptions. So this birth rate stays really, really high here. However, the longer it stays high, then it begins to decline. People are realizing like, oh, look, if I have 4 kids, all 4 are going to survive. And we also see that women typically here begin to have access to some type of family planning. That can be birth control, that could be a rhythmic method, whatever it is, but families start to have access here. And so the birth rate begins to decline. Women are receiving more education in terms of family planning, as well as going to school and getting education. We now see that women attend college at a greater rate than males. And what we really want to see is not everybody has to go to college, but everybody needs to have a skill. And so more and more women are entering the education field in order to gain some type of skill. And so that's here in the industrial stage. And so because women are going to school, because they're receiving family planning education, that birth rate begins to fall. My death rate has already fallen. At this time, between my birth rate going down and my death rate going up, I'm sorry, my birth rate, hold on. Now I can't. I'm going to annotate this. So here's your total population. When we see that birth rate and death rate are both high, this total population is relatively low. When the death rate falls, but the birth rate is still high, my population begins to grow, and then it begins to even out here, and it is even here. If we were to have a 5th stage, we would see that it would begin to decline even more. And so this is my total population, and I can label that. And so like I would screenshot this and I would put this in your notes. You need to know this, okay? And you need to know this total population red line. So again, total population is relatively low here because birth rates and death rates are both high. But as the death rate falls, the birth rate begins to increase. And then we see that it ultimately starts to even out as the death rate falls. And then it's relatively even here. As the kids become more and more and more expensive and women become more and more educated, this death rate falls even, or the birth rate falls even more, and the total population is going to decline. That's a problem because now you don't have as many workers in your economy. So places like Spain and Japan and Greece are faced in this, and that's a problem. When I lived in Spain, they had this whole campaign that said that was titled Renacer, meaning nacer is to be born. So renacer means to like be reborn. And what they essentially were saying was be reborn, move out of your parents' house, get married, have a family, be an adult, because their kids are not having babies. They're not getting married and they're not having kids. They may be living with a partner, but they're not having families. And that's a big problem because now you don't have anybody paying into Social Security. People want to retire, but there's nobody to take their jobs. And there's not enough people to fill all of the jobs in the economy. And that's a big problem. Okay, so again, pre-industrial state, birth rates and death rates are high, no population growth. The death rate lowers, we see that rapid population growth, the birth rate begins to decline, so the population growth evens out, and then the population growth is very slow here at the end, okay? And with that, I think I'm gonna be done. I hope this was helpful, and I will talk to you guys soon.